And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our friend and colleague, Joe Basta.
Thank you, Gail. So nice to see all of you. I don't know all of you. Some of you I know very well because we've worked together. I know Keisha and Susan, um, from prior endeavors, and I'm glad to have you all here. Um, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about and to discuss with mediators, because it's so fundamental to not just mediation, but everything we do, and it has a very interesting history. Um, the psychologists tell me that up until about the mid 70s, the primary thinking among psychologists was that humankind was basically rational in its decision-making process. And the only exceptions to the rationality was the thought that emotions like fear, anger, affect, or affection would alter the rational process that otherwise obtained. But in about the mid 70s, research came to the fore, which demonstrated that, the contrary to the current thinking, uh, there was cognitive wiring. Our natural cognition, in fact, got in the way, and was responsible for much irrational behavior, or behavior that was simply wide of the mark. And this led to a whole new field. It goes by different names. It calls it cognitive psychology, social economics, uh, but a whole new field sprung up of research that's demonstrated by now, and has been pretty well accepted, that um, there are a whole host of cognitive traps, biases that we naturally fall into, ways that we process information, that from time to time it can get in the way of sound decision making. And having an understanding of some of these basic principles and the fact that they exist is terribly important for mediators or people who are involved in conflict resolution, both so we can check these things in ourselves, and so that we can see them operative in the people that we're trying to serve. I'm going to flip back and forth between share screen and seeing all of you folks. And if questions arise in the course of this, we've got enough time that if you want to raise your hand or make a point, do speak up, and we shall have some time at the end. Let me pull up the. All right, everybody got this?
Yep, it looks good, Joe.
Okay. The people who started this, or who most recognized as being a primary import here, are Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, cognitive psychologists. Tversky died, I think 15, 20 years ago. Some of those of you are familiar with Kahneman. Kahneman just recently died, I think, at the age of 93. And in '02, he won the Nobel Prize for economics for the work that they did in decision making, which really resulted in what many have called the top 10 psychological traps. No small achievement in cognitive science, and certainly worth a Nobel Prize as far as I'm concerned, because of the insight that it's given us in in decision making. This stemmed from research that was done in the 70s and 80s by Kahneman and Tversky, where they found consistent biases in our decision-making process. In fact, they published an article, I think it was in 1974 in Science magazine. And even today, I think it's been one of the most widely cited articles in behavioral science, and it first introduced this notion of psychological traps and biases. Let me. I want to do just a little thought experiment, just a subtle way of showing you how this. How insidious this is and how it works. It's kind of an interesting example. I don't have this on a slide, so I'm going to ask you to just follow me in the question that I'm going to pose to you. And as you consider the question, I want you to assume that that Steve was selected at random from a representative sample. An individual has been described by a neighbor as follows, okay? Steve is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with little interest in people or in the world of reality. A meek and tidy soul, he has need for order and structure and a passion for detail. Let me read you Steve's description again. Steve is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with little interest in people or in the world of reality. A meek and tidy soul, he has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. Is Steve more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? Now I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you think, those of you think that Steve is more likely to be a librarian. Anybody? You got to be honest. How many of you think that Steve is most likely a farmer? Okay. Susan, why do you think Steve might be a farmer?
Well, I just thought from his description that he could work alone a lot and he'd probably like that. And I suspect to be a farmer, you have to pay attention to a whole lot of details.
Alexandra, you raised your hand too. You're muted.
It sounded like somebody that was talking plain language and was more likely to be a common way of thinking.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think the most people, and of course, the problem with a group like this, oftentimes when you ask these kind of questions, is that this is a unique population because of your backgrounds and because of your interests. So some answers are going to be skewed by virtue of you're not a representative sample of the population at large. Most people would resort to stereotype and figure out that or think that Steve is a librarian from the description. Most people would not have the information or go through the thought process to have figured out that if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, farmers outnumber librarians by about 20 to 1, or maybe more than that. So on a purely statistical basis, Steve is far more likely to be a farmer than a librarian because there are way more of them. And yet that's not the way that most of us would answer a little problem like this. It's a subtle indication of how one might resort to stereotype. I'm having a problem here already. Let's see.
Try go back and then make sure when you go to screen share that you pick the presentation.
Yes, yes, indeed. You think, Gail, I've done this, I've used this enough. You'd think I would catch on, but no such luck. Okay, these are the most common traps, widely regarded as the top 10. And as I say, they stem directly from the research that Kahneman and Tversky have done. Some you recognize, and some you may not. Anchoring, confirmation bias, projection, framing, loss aversion, naive realism, overconfidence, reactive evaluation, selective perception, and self-serving bias. We could spend an hour or more on any one of these, but I want to kind of flip through them and raise some questions or make some observations that are pertinent when it comes to these traps. First up, and this is one that I'm sure is common to known to most of you, is the whole idea of anchoring, by which we form estimates of value that we don't know by comparing it to something that we do know, such that the anchor controls our thinking. I teach a class in negotiation for law students at Michigan State, and when I do the chapter on these traps, I always give them an exercise. I will give them a questionnaire or disseminate a piece of paper that I tell them it's Global Earth Day, and ask them to judge, as I put here, is the population of Turkey more or less than 40 million? And have them guess what they think the population of Turkey is. What they don't know is that if I have a class of 16 students, I will give 8 of them a questionnaire that says, is the population of Turkey more or less than 40 million? And I'll give another 8 students the same questionnaire, except that it'll have the number 80 million in it. And then I will ask them to average up their guesses. And almost invariably, the students that have been given the $40 million figure have answers that cluster around 40 million. Those that are given the $80 million figure have answers that cluster around 80 million. And year after year, this seems to pretty much work out almost without exception. And as most of you are familiar with here, the anchor is used all the time in advertising. It's what makes shoppers bite at the notion that goods are on sale, because a lower number is posited along with a higher number. And even though we know about or may be familiar with the technique and know that these are just numbers that some merchant has put on a piece of merchandise, we still fall for this heuristic or shortcut that the brain bequeaths on us. The question where this becomes particularly important when you're talking about mediation, negotiation, any kind of conflict resolution that's involving figures or numbers, is do you make the first offer? if you want to take advantage of anchoring, the suggestion would be yes. But oftentimes, you may not have particularly good at the person you're helping, or you may not have very good information, and may be unsure of what kind of number to use, or what kind of value to advance. So you may be better off simply waiting until you get more information, or having the other person speak first. So then the question arises: what do you do to avoid taking advantage of anchoring? I mean, anybody have any thoughts on this? Either from a mediation experience you had, or from your own experience. You know the phenomenon exists is a way to plant something in your brain. So what do you do to counteract it?
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. It's Kate. Good to see you. I have a question about this because this came up in a mediation and it got me thinking about, and I'm familiar with like some negotiation tactics and things like that. And there's certainly a power dynamic when it comes to anchoring, kind of who makes the first move, how they anchor, and people who are really sophisticated at negotiation will, anchor higher, obviously, than their walk away, right? And all that. So what I was thinking about was like, is there any guidance, or what have y'all experienced about sort of like, is there a best practice in terms of whether the defendant or the plaintiff gets to sort of like anchor? Like there's an automatic anchoring in the case anyway, because it usually comes with some kind of number that's put out there.
Mm-hmm.
But when we start getting into conversation, people have different needs that come up, right? So I guess what I'm kind of wondering is like, there's sort of a plaintiff defendant power dynamic there, and like who can or should anchor first, and how do we kind of navigate that? But also like, other things I've experienced, like in the case where, there's maybe a company that is part of this, and then an individual, and the company has like two representatives there, and the individual is sitting there by themselves. Like there's a power dynamic there. And so when you've got like two business guys who come in and are like sophisticated negotiators who are like purposefully anchoring the negotiation and kind of know what they're doing, and somebody who maybe like doesn't do this for a living, and is just kind of trying to figure it out. Like, I just kind of wonder how that all plays into this, and what we can do as mediators to like level the playing field. Does that make sense? I don't know if other people have come across that, but that's what I was thinking about.
Well, you walked into something that is more expansive even than anchoring, as far as when you start to get into power imbalances, because you're starting to get into negotiating styles and preparation for the whole thing. Dealing with power imbalances, I think, that's a whole other can be a complex subject matter. Anybody else want to offer a suggestion? But I think the question is, what do you do? What's the antidote to the anchor that's thrown out, or is there one? Kahneman, interestingly enough, in Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and which sort of underpins this whole process. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was a New York Times bestseller. It's about 10 years old now, maybe a little bit more than that. But it's a wonderful book that goes into detail about many of these issues, and I think I think it's an important, for serious mediators, people who are really into conflict resolution. I think Kahneman's book is a very important read. But the basic idea is that the brain employs two sort of cognitive processes. One which is very quick, intuitive, from the gut, quick judgments that are made on the spur of the moment, based upon the information at hand. And this is the thinking, the fast process from which many of these traps arise. And then we also have a thinking slow cognitive process, where we bring thoughtful deliberation, analysis, to whatever the issue is at hand. Unfortunately, the slow part of the brain is very lazy. It doesn't like to be put to work, because thinking slow is hard work. It's much easier to think fast and resort to the cognitive shortcuts that we regularly employ, rather than to take the time to deliberate and determine what bring serious thought to bear on a problem. When it comes to anchoring, interestingly enough, Kahneman in his book, he suggests that probably the best anchor from a cognitive psychological point of view, when you're given an anchor, particularly one that you think is outrageous, is simply to leave the room and not even respond to it. But he recognizes that that's not a viable solution for most people. So the next best suggestion is to bring the slow part of the brain to bear, and to probe the basis for the anchor. And meet the person who has articulated the anchor, explain the rationale for it, and bring the whole thing out of the area of quick thinking, emotion, and bring deliberation to bear as a way to temper the effect of the anchor. From my experience, though, it's easier said than done, I think, to try and do that. But I think the advice is still helpful. I think the important thing is to understand how this particular trap works, to know that if you bring the thought to bear on it, you can provide an antidote, or you can provide a counter anchor. That's, as some negotiators and mediators have suggested, when you're faced with one anchor, come up with another one. The problem is, you're in a position where maybe extreme offers lead to an impasse. But there's no one right answer to this, unfortunately. But it's something that everybody has to know about and understand the dynamic. I think if you're going to help people who where an anchor comes up, as it often will, in a negotiation. Anchoring. Let's see. Next, confirmation bias. This is a great one. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And unfortunately, something that, for better or for worse, we all fall prey to. This is the tendency to credit information that's consistent with our existing beliefs, rather than the information that we may receive that's challenges them. This is something that makes the internet go round. If you pay any attention to what's going on, or to social media. New York Times good, Wall Street Journal bad, MSNBC good, MSNBC good, Fox News bad. You can name your what you think is your favorite silo, and this is a confirmation bias at work. The problem here, of course, is that we all tend to get stuck. We gravitate toward our own point of view and move away from one that we don't particularly care for. And here's a clear confirmation bias provides a ready example of where thinking slow becomes a painful process. If you have as we all do, if you have kind of preferred point of view, it can be very difficult and challenging to seriously entertain an opposing point of view and to think about it and to give it some credit. It requires mental work that many of us don't want to engage in. You may think a national newspaper is the greatest thing in the world. Take a chance on subscribing to one that has a different editorial point of view, and pay attention to it. It can be a difficult and challenging thing for people to do, however necessary it may be to enlighten ourselves or to consider the possibility, God forbid, that we may be wrong in our ideas or attitudes. And as I indicate here in this little blurb, the research that's done on negotiation, surprise, surprise, indicates that the greatest failing is the inability to see another person's point of view. I've listed a number of anecdotes here for confirmation bias. Active listening, exchanging and acquiring new information, and reality testing. Any thoughts from the crew here as to, beyond what I've listed, as to how you might help someone beat or deal with confirmation bias?
I have a question, Joe.
Yes.
Is there a listing of, you would say, the top 10 information that you can get from news? Like, are there somebody have critiqued all of these stations and said, look, if you really want unbiased information, go here?
I'm sure they exist. I'm sure they exist. But there's some, interestingly enough, there's one, I mean, I'm throwing this out there as an example because I just happened to trip upon it. A very interesting young reporter, I say young, she's probably not all that young, but some of you may be familiar with Barry Weiss, a woman by the name of Barry Weiss, who acquired notoriety, among other things, for leaving the New York, resigning from the New York. She was on the Wall Street Journal. She worked for a number of years with the New York Times, resigned from the New York Times because what she regarded as too much groupthink in the newsroom. Started her own podcast and has now she and other so-called independent reporters have put together a publication called The Free Press, which purports in some ways to be sort of an aggregator. They'll show you all the things that they're every day they'll post the things that they're reading, maybe 10 different stories, and they'll come from all different. They may come from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, The Hill. But they purport to kind of put together sort of a centrist conglomeration of points of view. You can make your own judgment as to whether or not you think something like that is worthwhile. and I think there are others that purport to aggregate, but I think they're out there, but they don't have much prominence. Does anybody else have a thought on that? Whether there's somebody that purports to say, hey, if you want you want a sort of a middle of the road or a more moderate way of looking at the news, here's how to do it. Gail?
Kate just shared a link to one, and a friend of mine who is a social studies teacher in high school, she has and I can't remember the name of the source, but it might be sort of like what you described, Joe, but where she uses it to talk with her students about different perspectives, and there is some neutrality. But anyway, I just texted her, and maybe she'll send it to me, and I'll share it with you all.
She just posted
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
but it's an interesting and necessary endeavor. If you want to try and crawl out of your silo, whatever it may be. But back to my initial, on that's sort of the macro level, but on the micro level, in terms of your mediation or conflict resolution, any thoughts on how to help the people you're working with deal with confirmation bias?
You're muted, Diane.
Yeah, Diana?
I would just say that so far, these first 2 points, I just go back to 2 common assets we have as mediators, or maybe 3. One is to decrease power imbalance, our paraphrasing, make sure we do it for everyone, because then the paraphrasing brings, in my mind, essentially helps equalize the playing field, as it were. Something else, I think, to slow things down, interrupt a pressing, if there's people pressing, either way, is to go to caucus, because that slows things down. That's also a way of allowing new ideas and information to come in. Take a breather. I mean, those are obvious, but I think we need to endow them with more affect, perhaps. And the third, I would just posit that I like to, I'm having a hard time thinking just as a negotiator. I've done negotiations, right? But I prefer to maybe keep thinking of this as a mediation as opposed to a negotiation, and just remind myself to keep the social justice, restorative justice aspect going in there. That helps me verbalize probably how I'd want the parties to be thinking.
You've raised a number of interesting points. First, if hopefully I can catch them all. Framing is one of the things. It's on the top 10 list, and one of the things I should have pointed out at the outset is these traps they're all related to one another. Okay, there's no. They're not all separated by bright lines, and the point you made about framing is a good one. One way of counteracting a confirmation bias is to restate or reposition the dialogue in a way to change the frame of a reference. And the other point you make is one that I would make at the end of all of these slides, in terms of dealing with all of these traps in the aggregate, and that is slowing down, and that is the need to bring into play the more deliberative part of the brain. The other suggestion that I would make, and I think ties into what you're suggesting, Diane, is to adopt a position of mindfulness in approach. Some of you may know that mindfulness is being taught in a lot of law schools throughout the country as a way to humanize, civilize, enhance the practice of law, and it's particularly important, I think, in conflict resolution, because it's one way of in which we can get ourselves to step back from whatever the situation that we're in, move away from the emotion, move to a deeper part of the self, if you will. A way of bringing peace into the room, as some mediators have said, is a way to deal with all of these these traps. So, and you managed to touch on all of them. Thank you for the segue. If we don't have time to cover all of this stuff, we'll one way or the other we'll touch upon it.
Joe,
Yes, I'm sorry.
if I could, this is Keisha. I apologize, I can't be on camera. But one of the things that, in my experience, with confirmation bias and people who are just kind of set in their belief of how something went, is to focus less on trying to change their mind about that thing and more on just trying to get them open to the possibility that the way you saw it, is not wrong, but it's possible that someone saw it a different way.
Mhm.
And if I'm doing this with someone in mediation, I'm doing it with them in caucus. But one of the exercises that I've used, not in my actual mediation because it hasn't come across, but in my mediation class, is to show the students an item or to play a sound for them and have everyone write down what they see and what they hear, and then go around the room. And everyone, depending on their perspective, there are different sound exercises. Everyone typically has different things that they saw, that they heard. And I use that exercise to open up the conversation that we can look at the exact same thing, or we can hear the exact same sound. And based on our perspective, our position relative to it, we can hear and see that thing very different. And it's not that what I saw and heard is wrong, right? So you're not invalidating what they saw and heard, but it's also that the other person could have seen and heard something totally different. And I found that that's been a helpful conversation in opening up discussion about, yes, what you saw and heard is true, it's not invalid, but it's still possible for there to be these other perspectives and perceptions.
Yeah, that's a excellent point, and what you're really touching upon again is the whole notion that so many of these conflicts break down because of our inability to see things from another person's point of view. And what you're suggesting is, in your exercises, is kind of forcing people to consider that possibility. A cruder exercise that I use in connection with teaching this is to write a long sentence on the board. I don't have it here in front of me. It's just it deals with the notion of failure and success, and give the students 20 seconds to count the F's that are written on the board, and almost invariably, most of them, only out of a class of maybe 16, you may get 2 or 3 that get them right. The rest of them get it wrong, largely because we're not, when we look at things, particularly those of us who are experienced students, we don't read individual words. We see whole clusters of things. So we ignore, a lot of times we'll ignore prepositions, we ignore our articles, and focus on the big picture. So we miss the detail of the F's, but when we get the macro picture. But it demonstrates from a physiological point of view where your position, it could depend on your difference in eyesight. Some people see better, some people read in different ways, but these all affect the way that we all affect the way that we the way that we think. Okay.
Joe, I'm
Susan,
I'm just sitting here thinking one important way that we can use these ideas in mediation is to lay it out in our opening statement that you come at this with different perspectives, different ideas, and strong feelings about the issues that brought you here, and it's going to be really important to consider everybody's ideas and the different approaches and try to come up with some common ground.
mhm.
Like that,
For sure. I mean, I think anything that you can do as a mediator, when you recognize how these things work, anything that you can do to set the stage for a more conciliatory, open-minded way of looking at things is going to be helpful, or at least is far more likely to work and be helpful than anything else. So yeah, I think we need to think about how to deal with these things at every stage of the process, whether it's opening, whether you're in caucus, whether you're in joint session. No matter what it is, there'll be endless opportunities to do something to improve the situation. Okay, let me move on from confirmation bias. This is another truism here. Talking about this will come up in a couple of contexts. I don't want to dwell on it right here because there are a couple of other juicier ones that we can talk about, but this is something nevertheless to keep an eye on. And I think if we're all honest, I mean, our default position is to think that other people that we run into see the world the same way we do. When in fact, most of us know from bitter experience, particularly the older we get, that it's definitely not the case. This one is familiar to all mediators, but again, it's the whole notion of framing. Again, it's come from the field of cognitive psychology. The mediators, as such, didn't come up with the brilliance of this idea. Folks like Tversky and Kahneman and their like deserve the credit for it. The second thing I have, this is a great way of demonstrating the process. This is in the book that I use this as an example of getting what kind of reaction would you get from your minister if you asked, "May I pray while I smoke?" or "May I smoke while I pray?" Just a slight difference in phraseology would make a dramatic difference in terms of the attitude toward the person asking the question. And I think it was Diana, she raised in her question just a few minutes ago the importance of using framing or reframing to overcome confirmation bias. And it even the import of this is sufficiently pervasive that it really spills over into how we refer to one another in conversation. We and us as opposed to it and they. One generating collaboration, the other generating hostility. And this is a couple you've already hinted, indicated how this is most effectively used, which is couching the offer or the proposals in language that is likely to be heard, thinking in terms of gain and not loss. Any any particular gems that anybody has on the framing front, or dealing with this trap? I know it's the subject of a lot of discussion and among mediators generally. So this is one that everybody's or should be very familiar with. Any additional thoughts as about framing, good, bad, or indifferent?
So,
How about loss aversion? This is this is one that sometimes gets lost. That is, I think, really important for mediators to understand, and something that we all fall prey to. The simple notion that for some reason unique to our brains, we feel losses more acutely than we feel gains. The stock market can go up by a healthy percentage, and people don't think anything about it. But the smallest of losses seems to be very painful. We tend to value our own concessions better than the concessions that other people are giving. And I list here a couple of cousins that go along with loss aversion. The first being the endowment effect. My stuff is more valuable than yours and commands a higher price. And sunk cost bias, the tendency to stick with something because we've invested time and money in it. And these, the constellation of these biases tend to come up quite frequently in all kinds of mediations, not just because not just those dealing with money or dollar amounts, but also with issues and values. So what's the best way to deal with loss aversion? What kind of experience have you had in mediation, where a person or a litigant has been bemoaning how much they've invested in the conflict to date, and how one might deal with it? Anybody had any experiences with that come to mind with loss aversion? Alexandria?
yeah. One of the things that's done commonly is to let both of them know when they start getting too talkative about particular details, is to let them know that again, to remind them the process of mediation is to come to terms that both of them can live with, and that neither one is going to walk away with what they wanted when they came there. And in a nice way to kind of say, we need to get back to the center reason why we're here is when you go to court, you're not going to have a chance to talk that much. There's going to be a judgment made in very short time, which will probably not please either one of you. So why don't we get back to square one? Now, caucus, which is what Diane brought up, caucus is a very good way to break up a conversation that has gotten too much into, I gave this and you didn't give that, or I'm more into it than you're into it, and I have more to lose kind of talk. When that happens, I have found that my co-mediators are very good, because I haven't done that many mediations, but very good at saying, why don't we go to caucus and try to get at what the bottom line is for each one, what they're willing to give in, what they're willing to do to make this work. And I find that that works quite a bit. I think the caucus idea is a really good one when you want to get both people to stop whining about everything that they've lost or what they're going to lose, and say, look, we're here today in good faith to try to solve this problem. At least that's what I've done.
Yeah, I think that's that's an excellent point. And I think I should have the wrong thing here. I should have I should have put that on there. Because we've all used this, and I've used this a lot. As you say, when people get bogged down, they want to completely want to dwell on the past, and there isn't a damn thing you can do about the past, because you don't control it. All we control is the present moment and moving forward. So if you get people thinking in a forward thinking mode of approach, by definition, you get off the past and you get off the losses that they've sustained, and get into an area where you can really begin to do something about the problem, about the conflict. So I think that's one excellent way of dealing with it. But we're still going to find people who are stuck on the notion that, geez, I've invested X amount of dollars, I've invested X amount of time in this. And I think the trick is to find a way to, again, get them into thinking about where the gain is rather than the loss. And one obvious area that is sometimes overlooked has nothing to do with the finances or anything, but simply has to do with the peace of mind of putting the dispute behind you. That you can't put a price on peace of mind when it comes to resolving that. And it doesn't matter what the conflict is. It could be a nasty divorce. It could be a business dispute over dollars. It could be the breakup of a partnership. There is a premium on peace of mind that is unique. And I think if you can get people to focus on something like that, that's a real intangible gain that exists in virtually every conflict. That if you focus on it, it may help people really get unstuck. Anything else? Any other thoughts on dealing with loss aversion? Okay. This is naive realism. This is kind of like this is how I say these things are related to one another. This is related to consensus error or projection. We see the world as it really is, and those that see it differently are naive. We've all had experience where I'm sure in a mediation, where one party rejects the other party's proposal as being unrealistic in sort of a global sense. They're in terms of talking about the their point of view is rejected as really being somewhat naive. This is another example of how a failure to see things from the other person's point of view leads to impasse and the ability to come to any kind of resolution. I should have figured that we could all engage in a lot of self-help here in discussing these things, but that's fine. It just indicates to me how much productive time you could spend discussing these things, and then see how they really affect the mediations that we're doing. Well, let's try another one here, and we're not going to get through we're not going to get through all of it. Maybe I can choose a couple of my favorites. This is a good one. Overconfidence or egocentric bias. We've all, most of us have heard from what the radio or whatnot about Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average, which of course is a statistical impossibility. As is 70% of drivers believing they're above average in ability, also a statistical impossibility. How many times have you dealt with people in a mediation? This is certainly true when they're represented by lawyers, or you get lawyers involved. Overconfidence is a real problem. And as one of my now retired trial lawyer buddies always used to say about the litigation process. He would always say, "You never know what those daffy bastards are going to come up with." Is a way of indicating no matter how good your case was, when you put it to a group of people to decide, there's always the possibility that it could run off the rails. But we are so confident in our own ability that this comes to bite us again and again. And Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, has a lot of interesting examples of allied biases that tie into overconfidence, decision-making among corporations and people in groups, how people tend to value their own instincts, and when they're ratified or reinforced by other people, either because you tend to kowtow to what the senior people in the organization believe, you curry favor with them or whatnot. It's a real recipe for the organization running off the rails, because the likelihood is they're dramatically overconfident in their judgment. When the group joins in, it becomes even more fatal. And I suggest that again, once again, slowing down, invoking the slower part of the brain. The way to get around this is to help the parties think through their best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or their worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, and get them to seriously think about the possibilities. This is a related malady, another great one, reactive devaluation. whatever the other side comes with can't be good to us. This is I suggest a confirmation to a relative of confirmation bias. And here's where I think we as mediators can be very helpful. The way to deflect this kind of energy, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, is by taking putting the onus on yourself, deflecting the energy from the other side, and making the energy, the negative energy from the party who's going to react, focus on you as a way to deal with the phenomenon of reactive devaluation. If a resolution can be couched as your proposal or your spin on what people have come up with, I think it's a way of dealing with this bias in a way that can get the parties to move forward and dissipate some of the negative energy. Any thoughts on this? How you may have fallen on your own sword, so to speak, and taken tried to take the anger or the negative energy on yourself as a way of shielding the other party and moving the dispute to a more positive place. I'm sure you've all had the experience at some point or another where this has happened, or you may have been. Anybody had the situation where the parties have asked you, perhaps because they've reached an impasse, asked you to make a proposal or to suggest a resolution to the conflict. I remember one of the various first. This is going back a ways. A mediation I did for the Wayne Mediation Center, and I was teamed up with. I think I was working with Ed Stein, who I don't even know. He was a very experienced lawyer. Some people, those of you in Ann Arbor, may be familiar with. It was a state settlement problem where it was a group of sisters, and they could not agree about the disposition of the assets in the house. This is anathema to a lot of facilitative-based mediators, but they said, well, what do you think we should do? And I think it was Ed who made the suggestion. He said, well, you just want us to divide the property for you guys? And they said, well, that sounds like a great idea. So that's what we did. Stein and I literally divvied up the pots and pans, the various pieces of furniture and whatnot. And these folks went away happy as clams because, and they'd been fighting among themselves, but because we took it upon ourselves to do this and they all agreed upon it, I mean, it was essentially kind of it turned out to be kind of an arbitration, but it's an extreme example of how if people invite you to do this, I think I don't think it's inappropriate to make a proposal.
Yeah.
See if they want to bite. Yes.
Yeah, Joe, I also have, as a mediator, been asked for a mediator's proposal. This is from lawyers when lawyers are involved. And as a lawyer advocating in mediation for a party, I've many times asked for a mediator's number if the parties were not able to reach agreement. And in those instances, both when I was asked and when I asked for one, the mediator isn't deciding. The way it worked was that a proposal would be made and the mediator would give the parties a certain period of time to accept or reject. And if both parties accepted, the parties would be notified. And if one party rejected, the other side never knew what they said.
Right.
But I have found it to be really, really effective in getting matters resolved when the parties weren't able to do so. So I like mediator numbers.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've used the same technique myself, and it's well, it doesn't always settle the case, but the technique works, and the parties seem to appreciate it. I mean, they um, uh, it's moved things forward. Yes, Gail.
I've seen that used. Can you just talk a little bit about that and anchoring?
Well, I mean, this may anchoring may have occurred earlier in the negotiating process. Well, it is. I mean, it is going to result in some kind of anchoring phenomenon. But when this comes up, I mean, this is kind of a last. Making a mediator's proposal, I mean, you're kind of at the end of the line in terms of resolving things, to get beyond an impasse. So, whether and how it operates as an anchor, it seems to me is almost irrelevant. I mean, you're making your best judgment and making the proposal. Yeah, it is going to serve as an anchor for the person who rejected it. And one of the other areas where this kind of ties in, and it's not a problem anymore since the rule has been changed to essentially make a case evaluation voluntary. The teeth has been taken out of the problems that mediators ran into is if there was a case evaluation first that put a number on the case to try and settle it. It became very difficult in mediation to get around that because people had already become anchored by the case evaluation. So I had always recommended to people, if you want to engage in the several kinds of dispute resolution, do mediation first, so you can get into a forum where anchoring is not going to be an issue, before you ask somebody to actually evaluate the case. But again, I don't think anchoring should be a problem, because the mediator's proposal is going to be a last ditched attempt at resolution. Do you have any different thought on that, Nikisha?
No, I think that's exactly right. And it only happens when the parties invite it. Both parties have to invite that.
Mm-hmm.
And in my experience, this is after literal hours and hours and hours of mediation. And because as the mediator, you have information about where the parties' true positions are. You have a sense of, is this somewhere where the parties really are able to resolve, but there are other barriers to them getting there, like the negotiation strategies they're employing. So you have a decent sense of where the parties are willing to resolve what they will find to be acceptable. And so when those circumstances align, the parties are asking for them, you think that you can actually come up with a number that's going to be acceptable to both parties, and all other efforts have been exhausted. In my view, mediator numbers can be very effective. If it doesn't resolve, it can be anchoring, because there will be later settlement efforts in litigation. The judge will bring them in for a settlement conference. And so they're going to have a number in mind. So I wouldn't say that there's no influence, but the relative value of doing it when they ask for it versus the possible risk of anchoring, I think merits giving them a number to help them resolve.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly concur. You're right. You're quite right. If the process goes on, it is going to have some anchoring effect, but the cost benefit ratio is clearly in favor of doing it, rather than, because odds are you're going to settle the case, or at the very least you're going to get the parties closer together. I guess word about the I guess Gail, if you want, I'll shoot you a copy of the slides, and they're some of the meteor one and other meteor ones, we're just not going to get a chance to talk about. I'd really like to talk about selective perception and self-fulfilling prophecy. That sort of stuff. And I've got some information.
Well, maybe you can come back, Joe.
Well, we could do, yeah, we
Yeah.
could do it again on
Yeah.
a couple of these, or
Yeah.
some other interesting anecdotes from Kahneman's work. I mean, I really want to. This is the book, and it's not a quick read, okay, because of the complexity of some of the material. Although it's very well written, very witty, it's humorous in a lot of spots because of the examples they use and Kahneman's attitude toward this. But if you pride yourself on your rationality, this is a sobering cuff up the side of the head to demonstrate how that's not the case. And you know, it's calculated to give everybody a dose of humility, whether you whether you want it or not. So, but yeah, we can do that. It would be good to do that another time, maybe. Gail.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it. And when you send me that presentation, I'll send it around to everybody. And so great to see everyone here. And enjoy this beautiful day. And thank you for coming.
All right, and thank all of you for showing up and for participating. It was great fun.
Thank you, Joe. It
Good
was
luck.
wonderful.